Hey guys, welcome back to another Tim Cain reaction. Today on game rights. This should be a fun one. I'll read that later, Kenji's.
Hi everyone, it's me, Tim.
Hey Tim.
Today I want to talk about game rights. Specifically,
What about game wrongs, Tim? Can we talk about those?
who owns the rights to games that you're playing, and how the individuals who worked on those games, what they own and what they don't own. And as usual, I want to talk to you first about why I'm doing this video. A frequently asked question or comment that I get on this channel, I'm asked to review games. And sometimes people couch it as, I just wanted you to give your thoughts on this game. It could be a game that has just come out, which is very frequent, a game that is similar to a game I've made in the past, or even sometimes people send me links to their own published games. Sometimes they want to send me a design document and say, can I get your feedback on this? There are many.
That one's going a little bit too far, right? Because asking opinions on games is one thing. You can just say, oh, I haven't played it. Oh, I liked it. Oh, I didn't like it. But when you're asking somebody who's in the professional industry to provide their professional opinion, you're kind of asking for their undivided professional time, which requires a hell of a lot more time and focus, especially for like some big GDD or something. A little bit too much.
Reasons I do not do this. In fact, I made a video about it called Why I Don't Review Games, and I'll link it below. I needed that video because I get asked so frequently. It is my most frequently linked video in one of my own response comments that I've ever done. And people know not to take it personally because they asked me a question and I have a video that I made almost 2 years ago that addresses it. So they know this is not me telling them no personally. It's me just saying, no, I don't do that.
I mean, I'll tell you why I don't mind it, like, if you ask me my opinions, but my opinions don't really matter about games. Like, I had problems with Baldur's Gate 3 and Expedition 33, and yet those games are like some of the highest reviewed RPGs on the market. So, my opinion is not in the majority. There's no such thing as a correct opinion. So, I don't really feel right influencing somebody's decision to buy something. I can only tell you what impacted me the most, negatively and positively, what I didn't really care about, bugs that I encountered. And I mean, if this influences your decision to buy a game, okay, but it shouldn't influence your decision to like a game. If you love Expedition 33, if it is the greatest game that's ever been made to you, do not let anybody take that away from you.
I've decided I need one to talk about how legal rights to game IPs work. And I know I say IP a lot. It stands for intellectual property. It kind of covers everything about a game, how it looks.
And this is a really important discussion in relation to Stop Killing Games, since it does have a lot of overlap with copyright and IP laws, which I think will be one of the biggest pieces of contention used in I can't really say litigation, but in the lawmaking of, let me rephrase this. I think that copyright and IP laws will be one of the most important topics to discuss by lawmakers when they are discussing whether or not to write laws about Stop Killing Games. Because there are some infringements, there are some changes that would have to be made, some mandatory licensing, then you have third parties that are involved with that too, and all of this will need to be refactored to a certain degree in order for Stop Killing Games to see its intentions through to the end. And they might do that, they might not, but I can promise you that there would be a lot of lobbying money spent, and I personally don't think that you should totally rewrite IP and copyright laws just to protect people wanting to host private servers. It's too much of a slippery slope.
Looks, how it plays. I did address this in a video called Frequently Asked Questions, which I'll link below, but people miss that because it's buried in about 8 different questions I answer. So I decided I'll make a video specifically for game rights, and then when people ask me questions about, hey, do I ask you for permission for this? How do I make something that connects to a game you made? They know what to do. Also, I just think it's cool for many of you to understand how the game development industry works from a legal point of view. So I will try to keep a lot of legal terms out of this, but I'm going to try to explain at a very high level what it means to be in the game development industry and what kind of rights you have.
Yeah, and I think that is something that most gamers don't understand, and when they, and even developers too, because I mean, think of all the times that people have taken down fan creations, right? And I think that there is a line between protecting your IP and just stomping on somebody who had no other intention other than to respectfully make their, playable interactive fan fiction within the same universe. And I think some companies do this way better than others, others being Nintendo. I know Jagex allows you, even to some extent, to monetize your creative works in the RuneScape universe, I think up to a certain point, which is pretty cool. So I think some companies do this really cool, super well, others don't. But generally, people don't understand when they can and can't use something, and even when they've sold away the rights to their universe, but maybe they haven't sold the rights away to their universe, but they have to the game. How much do developers own of the code they make? Usually none of it, because part of their contract is that all the code that you make for the game is now owned by the company, things like that. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you might have taken like your libraries and licensed it to the company, right? And you might do a non-transferable license, meaning that, let's say I work at EA and I've made some really good code library, and I say, hey, I have this really cool code library, it'll save us a month of work, but I don't, want to sell it to the company. How about I license it to the company, but this is non-transferable, meaning that I don't want you to post this source code anywhere else. I'm only allowing you to use it for this game or in your company as a whole. And this is, again, one of the things that SKG is going to have to contend with, because in that case, the company has bought a non-transferable license to certain third-party code, and they wouldn't be able to like post the source code to that because that would violate the licensing terms. So there's a lot of little finer points to this that a lot of people don't think about. Maybe 10K a month.
The other reason I'm doing this is people think I make a ton of money from Fallout.
I wish you made residuals, but no, that's not how it works.
This happened when Fallout 3 came out. This happened when Fallout 4 came out, Fallout New Vegas, none of which I worked on. It recently happened when the Fallout TV show came out. People were literally leaving comments like, dude, you're probably driving a Lamborghini right now. Which, by the way, if you know me in cars, there's just so much wrong on that. So much wrong in that statement, I can't even begin to address it. But let me just tell you, look, I was on a team of people who made the original Fallout.
The company owned the IP, and then at some point it was transferred to Bethesda, either through purchase, through acquisition of the company, and therefore the assets and IPs. Sometimes when companies go under, they will sell off their IPs. Sometimes like to make money, right? They might be facing bankruptcy, so they're like, oh, let's sell Assassin's Creed, and then we can stay alive as a company, but of course we don't own that IP anymore or something, right?
And I was an employee of a company.
Mm-hmm.
So I was being paid a salary, and then after the game shipped, I got a bonus. Usually you get one bonus and then you don't get anything more. And that's it. There's no money paid out based on how well it's selling. Interplay owned the rights to Fallout. And years after I left, they sold those rights to Bethesda. I wasn't getting anything after the game shipped, and after I left Interplay, and after they sold the rights to Bethesda. Nothing. Which means you have to go to Bethesda for anything about Fallout. But this also frequently comes up with Arcanum. People assume that I, or me, Leonard, and Jason, the three owners of Troika, own all of Arcanum. And we don't. In fact, very recently, at least when I'm making this, but you'll of course see this a couple months later, someone asked me for permission to make a tabletop role-playing game in the Arcanum setting. And I had to explain that I don't own the rights to the Arcanum IP. I can't grant those. It's confusing where they are. Sierra owned it, and then Havas, and then Activision, and now Microsoft. You have to ask somebody at Microsoft.
I mean, there's a lot of that too, especially with older titles. I mean, I think Isn't it EA that owns the rights currently to Ultima? I'm pretty sure it's EA. Ultima game. Yes, they've owned it since 1992, and they just don't do anything with it, dude. It's like one of the strongest RPG names in history. I mean, I guess you're dealing with like a much older player base that would know Ultima, and if you try to make a new RPG in the series, but they just sit on it. They don't do anything with it. That's it's probably the same with like Wizardry and Might and Magic. I don't know who owns Might and Magic anymore. They were purchased by Ubisoft. Oh, that's right. I remember. Yeah. So Ubisoft's sitting on Might and Magic, all these great IPs just being sat on and done nothing with. Annoying. I remember because they tried to reboot with Legacy. Long story short, never go public as a company, never take on shareholders, stay private. The reality is like nowadays just never sell your IP. Never ever sell it. It's okay if you get publishing rights, if you get a publisher to publish a game in that universe, but you should maintain ownership of your universe. And so they will maintain ownership of the game, but now you're not destroying your legacy, right? And that was the same. You look at a recent example of Risk of Rain. Hapu Games sold Risk of Rain to Gearbox, and what is the first thing Gearbox did? They made a mobile game and tried to monetize the shit out of it, and then ruined a DLC. I don't know why they did that, personally. I don't know what the story was for that. All the more recent Ultima games were pretty unpopular. Yes, yeah, they were.
And I understand that people go, well, you own Troika, and Troika made Arcanum, so shouldn't you own the IP? No, the publisher did. Because that's frequently how those deals are made. You approach a publisher, and the publisher's like, well, what am I going to get out of this? And I'll talk about that in a minute, about what publishers may ask for. Now, what confuses this is I do own the code to Arcanum. I recently recompiled it. I recently made it into a Windows 10 native game, and with updated DirectX and all that. People misunderstand that. I can't use it to make an Arcanum 2. I can't give it away to people. The contract specifically prevents me from doing that. Mm-hmm. Why did we keep the rights? Well,
for tools,
I can and did use it to make another game. Temple of Elemental Evil sits on Arcanum's code. Yep. And just as a quick explanation of how this is happening, this is exactly the same thing I did with GNOME and TIG, the two operating system abstraction libraries. And I'll link a video below. It would be a whole video to talk about what those are. But basically, they made it so when we were making Fallout, we didn't have to think about DOS, because Fallout was originally a DOS game. We just wrote calls into GNOME, and GNOME redirected them to the appropriate DOS API.
Which this is another thing that people have to consider too, is that if they're, again with SKG, because this all kind of ties into recent events and what gamers are wanting, is that if you were asking a company to provide you with that source code is owned by the company. That is their IP. If you take a look at a lot of GitHubs, even if they're public GitHubs, that does not mean that you have a license to use that code. You may have a license to see the code, and to maybe it offers you the ability to compile your own version for personal use, but that code is still written by somebody, and that is their property. So all that source code files for like private servers for games is still owned by the company, and you cannot use that for commercial purposes unless the company has authorized usage, and that usage for like game servers would only be to host the game server and not to use that code in your own project or other games, right? So, with Stop Killing Games, it is going to have to contend with all of those existing laws, which have been unchanging, and forcing companies to do certain things with their IPs is unprecedented in the gaming industry. This has only existed in cases of, for instance, maybe like some public or some like healthcare website that everybody uses is going to go bankrupt, and the company and they might do mandatory licensing for it until a replacement has been put in place because there is a some public safety or health interest in doing so, but that's never extended beyond those confines into the entertainment industry. So it'll be very interesting to see what the EU Commission discusses, but I don't see it going very far when it comes up against that wall, but I could be wrong.
We did the same thing. Well, later we made a Windows version, and then suddenly Fallout worked on Windows because the calls into GNOME, instead of going to DOS, went to Windows. There was a programmer, Chris DeSalvo, who went home for a weekend at Interplay and came back with a Mac version of GNOME. And about 90% of it was working, and suddenly we had a Mac version of Fallout. It was really cool.
That is cool.
Well, guess what? I learned a lot from that, how powerful that one decision was early on in Fallout. So I did Arcanum in a similar way. There was an OS abstraction library called TIG, but also the engine and the mechanics were kept separate. So the engine might ask things like, what's the distance between these two people? Do they have line of sight with each other? Can I pick up this item? And then the mechanics part of the library would answer those questions, but those were kept separate, which meant when we made Temple, we could throw away all the Arcanum system mechanics and replace them with D&D 3.5. And now we've got a game running using D&D 3.5. Now, we did a lot more. We completely changed how the sprites work. They have 3D sprites in Temple, so there were smooth rotations and much smoother walking animations. But in general, the engine handled everything that wasn't a game, that was not game unique, and then there was a game library that handled game unique stuff, and then both of those sat on top of this OS abstraction library, so neither of them knew what kind of machine they were running on. Whew, that was a long explanation. So the short of it is, I do own Arcanum's code. I can't use it to do anything Arcanum related because Sierra owned the IP. So let's talk about rights specifically. In general, if you want to know who owns the rights to something, you follow the money. And by that I mean true. Who paid for the game or who paid for most of the game. And at least how I made games, this was usually a publisher. They paid most, if not all, of the cost of making the game. Now, if the developer pays some of it, then they can keep some of the rights. Sometimes they get to keep the IP. A little less often, they get to keep art that was used in it, so they can reuse it in their other games as long as they significantly change it.
I mean, and you would need to specify exactly which art too. Like, is it 3D models? Is it the textures, the materials? What specifically about the art is going to be reused? I do see IP ownership becoming less and less common from publishers, but that also means that if you aren't selling the IP, they're going to need to pull something else out of there, and it's usually like bigger percentages, heavier recoupment clauses, things like that. Of course, if you do sell the IP, you might be able to negotiate a better rate for the publishing deal, which could be useful in some cases, especially if you aren't really expecting to build upon a universe. But generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend ever selling your IP anymore these days, just because it is your legacy and people would want to see, if they like your flavor, they want to see more of that flavor going forward with the games that you make. So selling away those IP rights is really, really dangerous. But usually, and almost always, when you do get a publisher, even if you own the IP yourself, or the company does, the publisher is still going to own rights to that game, so that they can decide what they want to do with the game. But you also might have an exclusive right to be the ones to make DLC for it or whatever. It can get as granular or as broad as you want. Obviously, you usually want more non-vague, super descript, explicit wording in your agreements, because then there isn't a potential loophole that the publisher is going to abuse for you. I've seen some that are worse, some that are better.
Sometimes you get to keep the code. That's what happened with Troika. We got to keep the code, even though Sierra paid for the development of Arcanum. That often comes with caveats, like I can't give the code out, I can't use the code to make a Arcanum game. They also got rights for the sequel. So we couldn't have gone and made a sequel somewhere else because the publisher reserved that. I get to do that.
Yeah, that's pretty common too. And also this is relevant to note that if a game were to be taken offline or were to die or something, right? Quote, die. That doesn't mean that it's just now up for grabs, right? That is still owned by the company. The IP is still owned, and usually, especially even if a company goes under, those rights are then sold or bought by another company in almost every case. So that has now been transferred away. So even though uh, these companies that Tim has worked at and who created these games are now defunct, those rights are now owned by somebody else. So you can't just port Fallout 1 to a different console on your own desire and make money off of that. The moment that Bethesda gets whiff of that, cease and desist is going to arrive at your door very fast. So
these can get very complicated, by the way. Sometimes they ask for first right of refusal. Like if you go to make a game with someone, they want
basically like, hey, we have a sequel. Do you want, here's what our plan, first dibs is up to you, and they can have that right to refuse or to continue. Or they might, I don't know, there can be little granular pieces to that sort of deal, but that is pretty common these days.
To be asked first, and only if they say no can you go to someone else. Sometimes they ask for last right of refusal, meaning you can talk to everybody you want, but you have to go to them last. Very complex. Please, I beg you, if you ever think about going to game development on your own, please get a lawyer. Don't think, I'm smart, I'll figure this out. Especially don't think, my cousin Vinny's smart, her figure it out for me. Please find a lawyer.
God forbid ChatGPT write me a publishing agreement for a game company
who specializes in this, because the publishers have done this a lot. You'd be well served by a lawyer who knows what he's doing.
Yes.
Anyway.
And also, not just the lawyer, but also talk to other developers who have signed contracts and let them tell you about the red flags that they saw or have experienced so that you can see if that's an issue in yours as well. It is a back and forth kind of deal, right? So you will be sent the first draft. You will then send back what you think of it or things that you want added or potentially revised or removed or changed. And that will go back and forth sometimes for months before a final deal is actually made and you get that first payment or something to start working on it.
So by this time, people are probably going, well, what can I do to own it all? I want to own it all. I made this game. I want to own it all. Well,
if you want money, you have to give up something, right? Because it's not just, hey, give me the money to work on the game and I'll see you in 3 years when I'm totally going to have it finished. And I promise that you'll make a profit from it. Yeah, it's not going to happen.
The simplest answer is pay for it all.
Yes, self-fund it.
You pay for it all, you own it all. The moment anyone else does something, especially if they give you money, or if they work for you for free, you may be giving away some of the rights to your game.
And you only have one pie. You only have one pie. And the moment you give 10% away of that, for whatever reason, you only have 90% of that pie left. And every little piece is going to have to be broken up. And you have to consider, okay, we plan to sell this many copies, lifetime, or even let's just say one, in the first month, because we need to keep our company alive during this month or first quarter, whatever. We plan to sell this many copies at this price point in this quarter. How much money are we going to give away from the net revenue of that to other people? Maybe it all goes to the publisher because they have a recoupment clause. You keep none of it. Or maybe their recoupment is they will take 70% until fully recouped, and then they'll take 50%, which is also pretty common, right? Because they understand that you have bills to pay as well. It's like, okay, but can we actually keep the company afloat and people fed and start working on the next game until this is repaid if, and it's a big if, sales numbers are actually what we expect? And that's really tough. That's why if you don't have to give away a piece of your pie, don't do it. And if you're just going to a publisher and signing away 30% of your net revenue, in order to get, I don't know, some help porting or localizing, consider maybe that some of this stuff can be done post-release, potentially, and you can use the net revenue that you would keep yourself to pay another company for it, a company that would take a flat fee and not take a percentage of your profits.
If you want to think of it as, if you want to own it, pay some. If you want to own some, pay some. You want to own it all, pay it all. Note that even if you pay for some of it, you are then going to concede something. With Arcanum, we gave up the IP but kept the code. Mm-hmm. Publishers almost always want the revenue stream. They control the money coming in, and then you get a portion of that. As I mentioned, they often want to control rights for sequels. Now, of course, you can always be a solo indie developer. I know nothing about that, so I'm not really going to address that. But that is a way for you to go forward and own all the rights. But in general, most of the people you see in the publisher, developer world are employees or contractors that are doing work for hire, back when WFH meant that and not work from home, and they don't really have any rights to the stuff they're making.
Yeah, I mean, even if you, because sometimes publishers will approach you, right? They'll say, hey, we have this game and this prototype, and we would like to hire you to work on the game, right? You're a studio for hire in this case. And therefore, you're not choosing the game that you work on, but you will have some creative control over how that game is developed. But ultimately, it's the publisher approaching you with that GDD and prototype. I mean, sometimes, honestly, I've sometimes seen publishers approach people with like the most bare bones, student made in 1 week, following a tutorial prototype, and say, hey, here's this totally not ChatGPT written idea for a game with this barely functioning prototype. Please, we'll pay you for a vertical slice for this. And you're like, what the fuck am I even doing anymore? But yeah, at that point, or if you approach a publisher and you sign a deal, you are no longer the owner of that game, and you are being hired to make the game, even the one that you might have sold. So you're like, here, I'm going to sell you this idea. And they're like, great, here's some money. Also, we want you to work on it. And so it's like, you're just a hired studio at that point. You are a contractor, or you're a contractee. I don't know. I think you're a contractor because there's a different term for the people contracting you or whatever, for this title that you sold them, and you don't own it. You don't own it. It might be your baby, but you might think it's your baby. You might have given birth to the baby, but you were a surrogate. And then the people that told you to give birth to the baby have now given you back the baby and say, also, we want you to raise the baby. But at the end of raising it, we get to keep the baby.
I guess that brings me to the last point, which is when I told people I was thinking about retiring, most of them were shocked. They didn't know how I was doing this, especially because, like them, I never made a big chunk of money from my games outside of my salary and whatever that bonus was we got. And all I can say is my retirement was funded primarily by 44 years of working and saving as much of my salary and bonuses as I could. Actually, I shouldn't say 44 years because the first 3 years of Troika, they were a negative. It's odd to think that I made the least amount of money in my career when I look back over it when I started my own company, but that's what it's like. That's the risk you take when you start a company. And it's weird, and this, for my non-American...
It's not there's not a black number at the bottom of the Microraptor revenue sheet, I'll tell you that. It's not black.
Viewers, like all Americans, I'm saving money hoping that I have saved enough to last me until I die, which hopefully will be many decades from now.
Hopefully. And
hopefully will happen by being crushed by a runaway semi-truck driven by the Incredible Hulk. Anyway, that's kind of how game rights work. That's how people in the industry tend to make their money. Mm-hmm. And I hope this kind of explains it all and explains why I don't have permission to grant any kind of rights to any of my games because I don't own them. So anyway, I hope this answers any questions people are asking me about Fallout, Arcanum, or any other games I worked on.
Yeah, it's this is a great video, by the way. It's really hard to start up a company in the industry when you can get a loan, right? You can get a business loan, but a lot of these loans are going to have that interest that you have to pay unless you have some number of months with 0% interest, right? You don't have to pay anything back up until a certain point. But you're making a game, and the games take years to make. So how do you start up a team without any funding? You either need to go and get a loan, you need to find some investment, or you need to talk to a publisher to get some funding. But the moment that you do this, you are suckling on somebody's teat, right? Somebody who wants to make money. And oftentimes you can get kind of stuck in a runaway cycle. I see it happen here in Poland all the time with, even people that I've worked with, start up their own company, get a loan, realize that they didn't budget their game correctly, need more money, go to a private investor and get another loan or something, but then they're using that money to pay back the first loan, and then they go to a publisher or they lie to an investor about how much money that they've promised to a publisher. It just gets messy. It gets messy, and then they go bankrupt, and no games get made. Everybody suffers. It's horrendous. Or, God forbid you manage to stay alive, but you're working on such a shoestring budget that you cannot afford anything additional, and you can't even afford to pay your workers what they're worth, what you want to pay them, because that would be a luxury, and you would have had to sell the publisher a deal for 1.5 million and not 1 million, but you cut salaries so that you could get a publishing deal, which technically keeps them paid and keeps the lights on, but nobody's happy about how much they're going to be paid. Yeah, it's tough, very, very tough industry where most people are just kind of surviving. And if you are lucky enough to be sitting with some, amount of safety net financially, you are in the minority by far. Economics moment. Yeah, this is a great video. Thank you again, Tim, for making these. And yeah, there's a lot to think about with game rights and with just how much money is flowing through the industry that people don't know about. Even I think there's a calculator out there, like how much money will my Steam revenue calculator. I don't remember what it's called. What's this? Yeah, based on how much net revenue you actually take. So gross revenue is 831,000, net revenue is 245. And that's what you take as a company, and then you might have to pay to a publisher, right, or to your investors in some way. Maybe you have an investor who funded you but takes 50% of your net revenue. Well, now you're sitting with $120,000 that you have to use to keep your 10-man team alive for the next year. I don't know if you know how much people cost, but 10 people cost a hell of a lot more than $120,000 for a whole year. So it gets pretty tough. Either way, thank you for watching that one, YouTube. We'll have one more up today, or maybe I'll save it to post over the weekend. We'll see. But if you're watching on YouTube, appreciate that. Catch you in the next one.